Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching this story from. I want to know how far this mystery is going. And if you enjoy true stories, macabre tales, and cases that leave more questions than answers, subscribe to the channel now. Because what you're about to hear today isn't just a story, it's something that has never been fully explained, and perhaps never will be. The silence in that small town of Villisca, Iowa, was never complete. Even in the deepest hours of the morning, there was always the distant creaking of old wood, the whisper of wind filtering through poorly sealed cracks, or the echo of footsteps imagined by restless minds. But on that particular night in June 1912, the silence had a different weight. It was dense, oppressive, as if the very air were aware that something irreversible was about to happen. The Moore family's house stood simply, yet respectably, in the center of town. A light-colored wooden residence with narrow windows and curtains always neatly arranged. During the day, it was a picture of normalcy, children's laughter, the coming and going of visitors, the smell of home-cooked food wafting from the kitchen. At night, however, it became just another vulnerable structure under the darkness. Josiah Moore was known as an organized, predictable man. His routine left no room for surprises. Business during the day, family at night, church on Sundays. His wife, Sarah, maintained the household with an almost silent rigor, as if every gesture were measured to preserve a delicate harmony. The children, in turn, filled the spaces with life. But that night, even they seemed quieter, as if an invisible instinct had alerted them. Hours earlier, the city still pulsed with a slight agitation. A religious event had brought residents together, creating a collective sense of security. People walked together along the dirt streets, exchanging greetings and promises to meet again the next day. Among them, the Moore family was returning home accompanied by two young visitors who had been invited to spend the night. Nothing seemed out of place, but there was something. An unnoticed presence, an overlooked detail, a period of time that no one paid enough attention to. As the lights in the house went out one by one, darkness enveloped the rooms like an ancient visitor, too familiar to be questioned. The doors were closed, the windows locked, the footsteps ceased, and then time seemed to stand still. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed. There were no initial screams, no desperate rush through the corridors, just a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of something that shouldn't be there. An intruder who arrived not in a hurry, but with intent. Every move was calculated, each step silent. The first impact didn't resonate through the house as it should have. It was muffled, contained, as if the environment itself were conspiring to keep what was happening a secret. And then came the second, and the third. The violence wasn't chaotic. It was methodical, room by room, breath by breath. No witnesses, without interruptions. Outside, the city slept. No neighbor woke up. No dog barked insistently enough. The world kept turning, oblivious to what was unfolding inside that ordinary house. Hours later, as the sun began to rise on the horizon, the Moore house appeared intact. No visible signs of a struggle from outside, no forced doors, no broken windows. Normalcy remained, only on the surface. It was only when the lack of movement began to draw attention that something seemed wrong. A neighbor, finding the unusual silence strange, decided to approach. She called, knocked, and waited. No response. Upon crossing the threshold, what he found was not immediately understood. The scene was not one of disorder, it was one of interruption, as if life had been abruptly paused without explanation. But as he progressed, the truth was revealed in fragments. Disjointed details, shadows out of place, and then understanding. The horror lay not only in what had happened, but in how it had all been done. There was no hurry, no sign of desperate struggle, just a cold, repetitive, almost ritualistic pattern. The house, now silent again, no longer felt like a home. It looked like a scene left behind by something that should never have existed there. And most disturbing of all, there was no immediate explanation, no obvious suspects, no clear reason, just questions, and a growing sense that this wasn't just a crime. It was something deeper, darker, something that wouldn't be easily resolved. The city of Villisca would never be the same. And that house, it would never be just a house again. Villisca was not just a small town, it was a living organism, sustained by repeated habits, watchful eyes, and memories that never completely faded. Each resident carried not only their own story, but fragments of the lives of everyone around them. Their secrets didn't disappear, they simply settled in silence, waiting for the right moment to resurface. After the massacre was discovered, the city's routine suffered a disruption that was almost imperceptible at first, but devastating as the days went by. Conversations on balconies became shorter, greetings more cautious. People still left their homes, still followed their commitments, but something had changed in the way they viewed the world and each other. The Moore house quickly ceased to be merely a site of tragedy and became a point of constant tension. Even empty, it seemed occupied by a presence that no one could define. During the day, curious onlookers approached, trying to understand the incomprehensible. At night, no one dared to pass nearby without quickening their pace. Among the residents, different interpretations of what had happened began to emerge. Some insisted on practical explanations, a crime committed by an outsider, an unknown traveler, perhaps a wanderer who found shelter in the house and decided to act. Others, however, could not ignore the details that were too strange to be a coincidence. There were inconsistent reports of lights seen in the house at unusual times in the days leading up to the incident. Small noises noticed by neighbors that, at the time, seemed insignificant. Movement in the yard, a door that appeared not to be completely closed, fragments that, individually, meant nothing, but together formed a disturbing picture. The local sheriff, pressured by the community, launched an investigation that quickly proved more complex than it appeared. There were no clear signs of forced entry, indicating that whoever entered the house did so silently, or was already there before the family arrived that night. This possibility, though rarely spoken aloud, began to circulate as an unsettling whisper among the residents. Among the names that came up in conversations, some were repeated more frequently, not because of concrete evidence, but because of behaviors considered strange after the crime. One man avoided eye contact. Another seemed overly interested in the details of what had happened. Small actions began to take on greater significance, fueling suspicions that grew uncontrollably. At the same time, secondary figures began to gain relevance in the city's narrative. The neighbor who found the house became a constant presence in discussions, recounting her experience repeatedly, each version with slightly different nuances. A local merchant claimed to have seen someone walking alone late at night, but couldn't describe it precisely. A traveler who had passed through the city days before disappeared without a trace. The two young women who had spent the night at the Moore's house also came to occupy a central place in how the tragedy was perceived. Not only because of their unexpected presence that night, but also because of the symbolism of their inclusion, as if fate had deliberately amplified the reach of the violence. As the days passed, the investigation ceased to be merely a search for answers and transformed into a mirror of the city's own hidden tensions. Old rivalries resurfaced. Long-standing suspicions gained strength. People who had previously lived in harmony began to observe each other with caution. Fear has ceased to be directed solely at the unknown and has begun to infiltrate even the closest relationships. And then a detail emerged that changed how many people viewed the case. The idea that the crime had not been impulsive. There was a method to it. There was time. There was permanence. The notion that someone could have been inside the house, waiting, observing, breathing the same air as the family, without being noticed, created a kind of unease that no simple explanation could alleviate. It wasn't just about who did it was about how it was possible. In this context, the house ceased to be merely a setting and became a character in itself. Its structure, its rooms, its narrow passageways and blind spots began to be analyzed with almost obsessive attention. Every architectural detail seemed to conceal a possibility, each shadow a hypothesis. Meanwhile, time passed, but the answers didn't come, and with their absence, something even more dangerous began to grow, the need to fill the void with any available explanation. Some began to believe that the person responsible was still in town. Others began to doubt everyone. And there were those who, in silence, began to consider that perhaps what happened in that house could not be fully explained by the ordinary limits of reason. Uncertainty has become the most constant element, and Villisca, once predictable, was now a place where any detail could hide something much bigger than it seemed. The investigation, which initially seemed to follow a logical path, began to fragment as new elements emerged, not as answers, but as disconnected pieces that refused to form a coherent picture. What should have brought clarity began to intensify the doubt. The sheriff and his team began to revisit every detail of the Moore house with a more meticulous eye. They were no longer just looking for obvious signs, but any indication that suggested behavior, intent, or prolonged presence. And it was in this process that even more disturbing aspects emerged. There were clear signs that the attacker had not acted hastily. Objects were moved deliberately, curtains adjusted, environments manipulated after the main act. It wasn't just violence, it was control, as if even after everything someone had remained there, rearranging the space according to their own logic. This detail profoundly altered the course of the investigation. If the perpetrator had time to remain in the house after the crime, then there was a disturbing certainty in his actions. He wasn't afraid of being discovered, or worse, he was certain he wouldn't be. From that point, two main lines of suspicion emerged. The first theory pointed to an outsider, an experienced individual, perhaps itinerant, accustomed to acting without leaving a trace. This hypothesis was supported by the absence of clear signs of forced entry and the coldness of the method used. A stranger who entered, carried out the murder and disappeared. The second, more unsettling one, suggested the opposite. Someone who knew the house, someone who knew the routine, someone who knew exactly when to act. This possibility began to gain traction as inconsistent testimonies emerged. Residents who initially claimed to have seen nothing began to revise their memories. Small details started to be remembered with greater intensity. A shadow, a muffled sound, a strange feeling that night. Among the names that circulated most frequently, one began to stand out, not because of direct evidence, but because of a series of behaviors that were difficult to ignore. A man known in the city, whose relationship with Josiah Moore was not entirely transparent. There were records of business disagreements, unresolved disputes, tensions that were never fully clarified. Nothing in isolation would justify such violence, but enough to fuel suspicion. This man came under closer observation. His routines, his schedules, his reactions to the case, and it was in this process that inconsistencies emerged. Moments when his location could not be accurately confirmed, answers that seemed too rehearsed, a visible discomfort when questioned about specific details. Still, something essential was missing: proof. Meanwhile, another layer of conflict was developing within the community itself. The pressure for answers began to create divisions. Some demanded immediate action, even without concrete evidence. Others advocated caution, fearing that a hasty accusation could destroy innocent lives. Tension spread like a silent disease. Families began to avoid certain topics. Old friendships were put to the test. Fear ceased to be solely about what had happened and began to project itself onto the future. If it happened once, it could happen again, and nobody knew how to stop it. Meanwhile, reports began to emerge more frequently, not only about the night of the crime, but about subsequent events. People claimed to hear sounds coming from the empty house, light footsteps, as if someone were still moving through the rooms, lights that seemed to turn on and off without explanation. Although many dismissed these stories as a product of collective fear, they contributed to something even more dangerous: the construction of a narrative where the inexplicable gained ground. The house, now isolated, became a focal point for everything that couldn't be explained. Researchers returned repeatedly, trying to extract new information from a scenario that had already been exhaustively analyzed, and with each return, the feeling was the same, as if something had been left behind, something that wouldn't be fully revealed. The prime suspect, under pressure, began to react more defensively. His statements became more rigid, less spontaneous. There were moments when he seemed about to say something more, something relevant, but he backed down at the last minute, as if he were constantly evaluating what he could or could not reveal. This ambiguity kept the focus on him, but it also raised a new question. What if he wasn't the only one? The possibility of more than one person being involved began to be considered, not necessarily as direct accomplices, but as pieces of a larger structure where information was shared, concealed, and distorted. At this point, the conflict was no longer simply between truth and the unknown. It was between versions, between perceptions, between what could be proven and what only seemed to make sense. And the further the investigation progressed, the more evident it became that the solution would not depend solely on finding a culprit, but on understanding a sequence of events that defied simple explanations. The city of Villisca was trapped in a cycle of suspicion and uncertainty, and what was most unsettling was realizing that the more one searched for the truth, the further it seemed to elude them. As the days turned into weeks, the case ceased to be merely a criminal investigation and began to unfold in multiple layers that intertwined in a disturbing way. Villisca was no longer just the scene of a brutal crime. It had become a space where parallel stories emerged, each carrying fragments that somehow seemed to connect to what had happened. One of these subplots began to gain traction around the neighbor who had found the house that morning. Her narrative, repeated countless times to different people, began to present subtle variations. Small details emerged in more recent versions that were not present in the earlier ones. Initially ignored, these differences began to be analyzed more rigorously. At one point, she mentioned smelling an unusual odor upon entering the house, something metallic, almost imperceptible. On another occasion, she stated that she noticed an interior door ajar, contradicting previous accounts that everything seemed closed. These inconsistencies raised an unsettling question. Had she truly seen everything for the first time at that moment? Or was there something she wasn't saying? This suspicion, however, never fully materialized. Evidence was lacking, only impressions remained. Another parallel story emerged from a traveler who had passed through the city days before the massacre. His behavior, as described by residents, was considered strange, reserved, observant, and not very communicative. He reportedly asked unusual questions about the city's routine, schedules, and movements. After that, he disappeared. No official record, no identity confirmation. The figure of this man came to inhabit the collective imagination as a convenient possibility. Someone from the outside, without ties, capable of acting and disappearing without leaving a trace. But at the same time, his lack of concreteness made this hypothesis too fragile to support conclusions. Meanwhile, a third subplot began to unfold more quietly, but no less disturbingly. The relationship between some of the city's residents and past events that, until then, had never been connected. Ancient stories began to resurface. Forgotten conflicts, discussions that ended without resolution. A name, mentioned in old records, reappeared in conversations. Someone who had left the city years before, after a serious disagreement, and who, according to rumors, might have recently returned. There was no confirmation, only vague accounts, imprecise memories, but enough to fuel yet another line of suspicion. These subplots, far from clarifying the case, increased its complexity. Each new possibility demanded investigation, but none offered a clear path. And over time, the investigation itself began to disperse, divided among multiple directions that rarely converged. At the same time, external pressure was increasing. Newspapers began covering the case with increasing intensity, often prioritizing impact over accuracy. Headlines suggested theories, pointed to suspects, and created narratives that quickly spread beyond Villisca. The city, once isolated in its routine, became the object of distant, curious, and judgmental gazes. This exhibition brought a new layer of tension. Residents began to be questioned by outsiders. Intimate details were transformed into public information. Privacy disappeared, replaced by a constant feeling of being watched. And with that, new reasons for silence emerged. Some began to avoid cooperating with the investigation, fearing repercussions. Others began to modify their accounts, consciously or unconsciously, influenced by what they read or heard. The truth, which was already difficult to ascertain, became even more distorted. At the center of it all, the prime suspect remained under observation, but now his figure competed with other narratives. He was no longer the only possibility. He had become just another piece in a puzzle that seemed to grow without limits, and then an element emerged that added urgency to the situation. The realization that time was working against everyone. The more days that passed, the more inaccurate the memories became. More evidence was being lost, more versions emerged. The need for a resolution ceased to be merely emotional and became structural. If nothing was decided soon, the case risked dissolving completely into speculation. This time, pressure intensified the investigation's efforts, but also increased the risk of errors. Decisions began to be made based on probabilities, not certainties. Paths were followed because they seemed plausible, not because they were proven. And in that environment, where everything seemed possible and nothing was definitive, one question began to become inevitable. What if the truth wasn't in any of those lines? What if all the subplots were merely reflections of something simpler or more obscure that no one had yet considered? The complexity of the case lay not only in the facts, but also in how they were interpreted. And Villisca, immersed in her own versions, was slowly approaching a point where distinguishing reality from construction would become increasingly difficult. The case was already saturated with different versions when something changed, not abruptly, but like a fissure that, as it expanded, revealed a layer that no one had seriously considered until then. It all began with a reassessment of a detail that for a long time had been treated as irrelevant: time. Not the exact time of the crime itself, but the interval before and after it. A more recent investigator, less emotionally involved with the initial findings, decided to reconstruct the timeline with obsessive precision. He wasn't looking for new physical evidence, he was looking for consistency. And it was in this process that he noticed something the others had overlooked. There was too much time, sufficient time not only for the execution of the acts, but for their continued existence. For moving around inside the house, for reorganization, for observation only. This finding completely changed the focus of the investigation. Until then, even in the most elaborate hypotheses, there was an implicit assumption that the perpetrator acted and left quickly. But if there was a prolonged stay, then the logic of the crime was different. It wasn't an escape, it was his domain. From this perspective, the house ceased to be merely the location of the crime and became a space of residence prior to the event. The hypothesis that the perpetrator was already inside the house before the family returned that night, previously considered extreme, began to gain traction, and with it, a disturbing revelation. Someone could have been there for hours, perhaps by observing, waiting for the right moment. This possibility led researchers to revisit old accounts with a fresh perspective, and it was then that a detail, previously scattered among secondary testimonies, began to stand out. One of the residents had mentioned, days before the crime, seeing a figure near the Moore's house at dusk. At the time, this was dismissed as something common, someone passing by, perhaps a neighbor. But now, by cross-referencing this account with others, a pattern has emerged. The same figure. Similar descriptions. Recurring presence, always in the surrounding areas, never interacting directly. This silent consistency indicated something more than coincidence. It indicated vigilance. The investigation then underwent a decisive redirection. Instead of simply searching for who might have committed the crime, the focus shifted to finding out who might have been observing the house before it happened. And at that point, the prime suspect returned to the center of attention, but in a new light, not just as someone with potential motivation, but as someone with an extended opportunity. New analyses of his movements revealed more significant gaps than initially thought, entire periods of time when his presence could not be confirmed. Moments when he could have been near the house without being noticed. And then came the element that transformed suspicion into something more concrete, an indirect connection to the interior of the house, not a key, not a formal access, but knowledge. Details about the layout of the rooms, regarding routines, regarding schedules, information that was not public. This didn't prove his presence inside, but it indicated something crucial. Familiarity. And this familiarity, combined with the assumption of permanence, created a plausible and deeply disturbing narrative. But the real turning point didn't come solely from that connection. It came from the reaction. When confronted again, this time with more specific questions, the suspect's behavior changed noticeably. There was no confession, nor any obvious mistake, but something broke down in the way he maintained his own version of events. There was hesitation, not the hesitation of someone trying to remember, but of someone weighing the consequences. His eyes darted away at key moments. His answers became shorter, less elaborate, and for a moment it seemed he was about to say something that would end the search. But I didn't say. This silence, more than any words, altered the researcher's perception, because, at that moment, the doubt ceased to be solely about what he had done, and it became about what he knew. Meanwhile, another detail emerged, almost as an echo of this discovery, the realization that the crime scene could have been manipulated not only to conceal something, but to convey something. The arrangement of the objects, the repetition of patterns, the absence of chaotic disorder, everything suggested intention beyond action, as if there were a message, not explicit but structured. This idea, although difficult to prove, reinforced the notion that the crime was not impulsive. It was planned, prepared, executed with a level of control that indicated more than simple violence. It indicated purpose. And with that, the investigation reached a point of no return. It was no longer possible to treat the case as a sequence of isolated events. There was a continuous thread connecting observation, preparation, and execution. And that line pointed to someone who was not only present, but who was present long enough to transform the house into a planned setting. From that moment on, everything that came before needed to be reinterpreted. Each testimony, every detail, every silence. And Villisca, who was already living under the weight of uncertainty, now faced something even more unsettling, the possibility that the truth was close all along, hidden not by a lack of evidence, but by the way everyone chose to look at it. The change in the direction of the investigation did not bring relief. It brought weight. A different weight, more focused, harder to ignore. For the first time, there was a line of reasoning that did not scatter into multiple possibilities. It pointed, with uncomfortable insistence, to a specific path. And that changed everything. The city, which had previously been divided by vague doubts, began to reorganize itself around a more concrete suspicion. The name that had previously circulated as a hypothesis began to be mentioned more frequently, with less hesitation. There was no official confirmation, but the collective perception was already beginning to solidify. This movement had immediate consequences. The man at the center of the suspicions began to be avoided. Conversations ceased when he approached. Eyes were averted, but not discreetly. There was judgment in them, a silent accusation that needed no words. His routine began to fragment. Places where he was once received normally became hostile, but the most significant thing wasn't social isolation. It was the way he reacted to it. Instead of directly confronting the growing distrust, he retreated. He became more reclusive, more difficult to reach. His public appearances diminished. When he did speak, it was with extreme caution, as if every word was being calculated to avoid any misinterpretation. This stance, far from dispelling suspicions, intensified them. To many, it seemed like the behavior of someone who had something to hide. For others, it was simply the reaction of someone who had been unfairly pressured, and this division further deepened the tensions within Villisca. Meanwhile, the investigation progressed, now with a more defined focus, but still lacking the essential element, concrete proof. The absence of direct evidence began to become an increasingly frustrating obstacle. There was coherence in the theory, there was consistency in the observed behaviors, but nothing to support a formal accusation. This void created a new layer of conflict. The need for justice began to compete with the demand for precision. Some argued that the body of evidence was already sufficient for more decisive action. Others insisted that any step without irrefutable proof could compromise not only the case, but the very integrity of the community. External pressure also intensified. Coverage of the case continued, now focusing on the new line of investigation. The suspect's name began to appear more frequently outside the city, broadening the scope of suspicions and making any return to normalcy impossible. This situation led to profound personal consequences. The suspect's family members began to be directly affected. Relationships were broken, children were avoided, suspicion ceased to be individual and began to contaminate everything around them. The idea of guilt, even without proof, began to behave as an established fact for many. Meanwhile, other reactions began to emerge among the residents. Some began to question the very conduct of the investigation. There was a feeling that by focusing intensely on a single individual, other possibilities were being neglected. This perception reopened space for alternative theories, rekindling doubts that seemed to have been left behind. Old stories have resurfaced. Stories about the traveler have disappeared. The figure of the neighbor was once again brought into the discussion. Nothing strong enough to replace the main line of suspicion, but enough to prevent it from becoming absolute. This movement created an unstable cycle. Each new doubt weakened the certainty. Each new suspicion reinforced the fear, and at the center of it all the house remained, empty, but still present as a symbol of everything that had not been resolved. Investigators kept returning to the site, not necessarily in search of new physical evidence, but in an attempt to reinterpret what had already been seen. And with each visit, the same feeling persisted, that something essential had not yet been understood. The idea that crime involved more than just action, that there was structural intent, perhaps even an internal logic, began to gain more traction in analyses. This led to a different approach, more focused on patterns than on isolated events. But this change also brought frustration, because standards by themselves don't condemn anyone, and time continued to move forward. Memories were fading, testimonies were losing precision. The urgency that once drove the research began to turn into burnout, and with that came a realization that was difficult to accept, that even with a seemingly clearer path, a resolution was still far off. The city of Villisca, now deeply scarred, began to coexist with a kind of altered normality. Activities continued, but under a constant layer of tension. What was once routine now carried an invisible weight. Nothing had been concluded, nothing had been resolved, and perhaps most unsettling of all was the feeling that the answers were close, but not close enough to be reached. As the months passed, the investigation ceased to be driven solely by urgency and began to demand something more difficult: resilience. The search for answers no longer progressed with the same intensity as before, and this forced those directly involved to change their approach. Direct confrontation with the unknown gave way to a quieter, more patient, but no less determined strategy. The investigator who had restructured the case's timeline became the central figure in this new phase. Unlike the others, he did not carry the accumulated emotional strain from the beginning. His initial detachment allowed for a more detached approach, less influenced by external pressures or community expectations. But with time, even he began to feel the weight of what he was investigating. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that affected him, it was the lack of resolution. The idea that all the elements were there, scattered but still inaccessible, began to shape his stance. He started to revise not only the costumes, but also the interpretations he had previously made. And it was in this process that its evolution became evident. Instead of seeking an immediate answer, he began to work with the possibility of error, not as a flaw, but as a tool. Every previous assumption was rigorously re-evaluated, including those that seemed most solid. He stopped treating the main suspect as the absolute center of the investigation and began to see him as part of a larger system of possibilities. This change did not weaken the case. It broadened its scope. Upon re-examining old testimonies, he began to notice patterns that had previously been ignored. Not obvious patterns, but small recurrences, repeated schedules, similar routes, behaviors that, in isolation, meant nothing, but which together suggested something more structured. He also began to see the city in a different light, not just as a setting, but as an active element. The residents' routines, the most frequently used routes, the least visible spots, everything began to be considered as part of a larger logic. And, little by little, a new understanding began to form. The crime was not only planned inside the house, it was planned with the city in mind. This realization brought about a significant change in the way the investigation was conducted. Instead of focusing exclusively on the interior of the residence, the focus expanded to the exterior. Movements previously considered irrelevant gained new meaning. The surroundings began to be analyzed as an essential part of the event. Meanwhile, the researcher himself began to change his way of interacting with those involved. He abandoned direct confrontations and adopted a more observational approach. Instead of pressing for answers, he began to create situations where they emerged indirectly. This strategy revealed important nuances. The main suspect, for example, displayed distinct behaviors depending on the context. In formal situations, he maintained absolute control, but in less structured moments, informal conversations, unexpected encounters, there were small lapses, micro-expressions, pauses, subtle changes in tone of voice, nothing conclusive, but it was enough to indicate that there was more to it than he let on. Other characters also began to be observed more closely. The neighbor, the shopkeeper, even those who had been previously dismissed. The goal was not to find a new culprit, but to understand how each one fit into the whole picture, and in this process, a new form of progress emerged, not based on isolated discoveries, but on connections. Small connections between events, behaviors, and circumstances began to form a more cohesive structure. Still incomplete, still without a final resolution, but closer to something understandable. This evolution, however, was not merely technical, it was personal. The investigator came to accept that the truth might not be simple or straightforward, that perhaps there wasn't a single answer, but a combination of factors that together led to what happened. This acceptance didn't mean giving up, it meant adapting. Meanwhile, the city also underwent its own form of transformation. The initial fear, intense and disorganized, gave way to more conscious vigilance. People remained suspicious, but in a less impulsive way. There was an attempt, however fragile, to regain some level of normalcy. But that normalcy was no longer the same. She carried memories. It carried an absence. He carried the awareness that something profound had been broken, and yet life went on. The investigation, now quieter, continued to advance, not in speed, but in depth. Each new connection brought the possibility of understanding closer, even if a resolution remained out of immediate reach. And in this balance between persistence and uncertainty, something was taking shape. The search for truth was no longer just a matter of justice. It was a need for meaning. The investigation had become less visible to most residents, but behind the scenes it was becoming more precise, almost surgical. There was no longer room for broad attempts or scattered hypotheses. Every move was now calculated, aimed at closing gaps that had remained open for too long. The lead investigator, after weeks of connecting patterns and reviewing testimonies, came to a conclusion that redefined the next steps. There was no lack of information. What was lacking was the right moment to confront it. The pieces were there, fragmented, yes, but consistent enough to support a nearly complete reconstruction of events. And this reconstruction pointed to something crucial. The crime had not only been planned in advance, but also depended on a specific element of the city's routine, a predictable window of vulnerability, a window of time, a recurring loophole. This detail became the focus of the final phase of the investigation. By cross-referencing the schedules, routes, and habits of the residents, a clear pattern emerged. There was a period when activity near the Moore's house decreased drastically, an interval where the city's natural surveillance practically disappeared, and this time frame coincided with the estimated time of the crime. This discovery not only reinforced the planning hypothesis, but also indicated that whoever was responsible had a deep understanding of how the city functioned. It wasn't someone who acted impulsively. It was someone who waited for the exact moment and knew exactly when it would occur. With that, several subplots began to resolve themselves, not through direct answers, but through elimination. The traveler, previously seen as a possible suspect, lost credibility. His presence did not coincide with the identified temporal pattern. His figure, although intriguing, came to be seen as noise, a distraction that diverted attention from what really mattered. The neighbor, with her inconsistent accounts, was also reinterpreted. Her variations ceased to be seen as suspicious and began to be understood as a reflection of the emotional impact. What previously seemed like concealment now appeared as fragmented memory. These resolutions did not completely close those lines, but rather shifted them away from the center, and in doing so, they narrowed the focus. The prime suspect has returned to occupy that space, now not just as a possibility, but as a central element of a logical structure. His routine fit perfectly. Their schedules coincided. His familiarity with the house and the city supported the hypothesis of planning, and more importantly, his lack of clear explanations for certain time periods remained unresolved. But there was still one obstacle. The final connecting point was missing, something that would irrefutably connect presence, knowledge, and action. And it was at that moment that the investigation made a risky decision. Instead of continuing to accumulate data, the researcher chose to provoke a reaction. He began to publicly reconstruct, in a controlled manner, parts of the timeline he had developed, not as a direct accusation, but as a plausible narrative. Details began to circulate, not all, but enough for someone involved to recognize the direction the investigation was taking. This strategy had a clear objective: to create pressure. Not the pressure of a formal accusation, but the pressure of recognition. If the person in charge was still in town, he would realize it, and upon realizing it, he would react. In the following days, small changes began to be observed. The suspect, who already maintained a reserved demeanor, became even more cautious. His movements decreased. His social contacts practically disappeared. But at the same time, new behaviors emerged, inconsistent with his attempt at discretion. There were moments when he seemed to be observing more than usual. Situations in which he avoided certain paths. And on one particular occasion, he was seen near the Moore's house, even without any apparent reason. This return to the place after so much time was interpreted as a sign, not definitive guilt, but it's about connection. Tensions have reached a new level. The city, though it didn't have full access to these movements, began to feel the weight of the case again. There was something in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen. Conversations resumed, eyes became more attentive. Normalcy once again began to unravel. Meanwhile, the investigation was approaching its most delicate point. Everything indicated that the next action would be decisive. There would be no more room for retreat, or the truth would emerge clearly, or it would be lost forever among the versions. And, for the first time since the beginning, there was a real sense of closeness. As if, after so much time, history were about to reveal what had always been hidden. The decision was made without formal announcement, without any attention-grabbing moves. There would be no spectacle, no public confrontation. The investigator knew that any direct approach could result in definitive silence. What was at stake was not just proving something, it was making the truth emerge before it could be buried forever. The final strategy was built upon everything that had been observed up to that point: patterns, reactions, gaps, but above all, upon behavior. If the suspect was involved, he would not react to the accusation. He would react to the inevitability. That night, the city seemed to repeat the same silence of months before. The empty streets, the absence of movement, the quiet that had previously gone unnoticed, now carried meaning. It was the same interval, the same gap. And it was at that moment that the trap was activated. The investigator, accompanied by a small team, positioned himself near the Moore's house, not to raid, not to confront immediately, but to observe. The hypothesis was simple and risky. If the suspect still maintained some kind of connection with the place, he might return, not out of necessity, but on impulse. Hours passed without any sign. The silence remained intact, almost oppressive. Expectation began to turn into doubt until a movement broke the stillness. A figure, discreet, cautious, approaching the house with measured steps. There was no rush, there was no hesitation. He was someone who knew the way. The investigator didn't order immediate action. He observed every gesture, every pause. The man stopped in front of the house for a few seconds, enough time to confirm something that couldn't be explained by mere curiosity. There was recognition. And then he went in, without forcing it. No problem at all, as if the space was still familiar to him. That was the point of no return. The team advanced silently, surrounding the structure. The entry was coordinated without fanfare, but with precision. The objective was not to surprise, it was to prevent escape. Inside the house, the air seemed denser, as if time hadn't fully progressed there. The figure stood inside, motionless for a moment, as if not expecting to be interrupted, not in that way. When he noticed the investigators, he did not try to escape. It didn't happen. He did not react violently. He simply turned around, slowly. And in that gesture, something became clear. It was no surprise. It was an acknowledgement of the end. The confrontation was not physical. It was verbal, short, direct. The investigator did not file formal charges, not at that moment. Instead, he began to describe, with increasing precision, the reconstruction of events, every detail, every movement, every interval of time. The narrative was not an assumption, it was a logical sequence, and as he walked on, the man's expression changed. Not in a negative sense, but it's a matter of wear and tear. It was as if, upon hearing that, he was being forced to relive something he had kept under control for far too long. There was a moment of silence, long enough that any subsequent word would carry definitive weight, and then, without dramatization, without raising the tone, came the breakdown. Not a complete confession, but enough. Fragments, indirect confirmations, subtle corrections at specific points in the narrative, details that only someone present could adjust. He didn't say, "I did," but he didn't deny it either. And in that context, that was more revealing than any explicit statement. The investigator realized that what he was facing was not just a guilty party. It was someone who had maintained a complex internal structure based on control, planning, and silence. And that control at that moment had failed, but the true impact of the climax didn't come solely from identification. It came from the final revelation. When pressed about the motive, the man did not offer a straightforward justification. Instead, he indicated something more disturbing. The crime was not driven by a single factor. It was the result of an accumulation, prolonged observation, unresolved resentments. An internal construction that found, that night, the perfect environment to take shape. There was no simple explanation, and perhaps there never was. But there was, finally, a clear connection between presence, action, and intention. The central conflict, which had been sustained for so long by doubt, has found resolution, not in absolutes, but in sufficient evidence to break the cycle of uncertainty. The house, silent once more, was no longer just a mystery, it became proof. And Villisca, who for so long lived in the shadow of the unknown, was finally facing something concrete, still disturbing, still incomplete, but real. The revelation did not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it brought a different kind of unease, deeper, more difficult to dispel. For months, Villisca lived under the weight of uncertainty, nurturing theories, suspicions, and vague fears. Now, with a line of responsibility finally established, the city needed to deal with something more concrete: the consequences. The man who had been at the center of it all ceased to be just a whispered name and came to represent an unsettling reality. He was not an outsider, nor a distant figure. He was someone who walked the same streets, who shared the same space, who silently observed while keeping his inner self intact. This proximity was what affected the community the most. The idea that the culprit didn't come from afar but from within profoundly changed how the residents perceived themselves. Trust, already shaken, became even more fragile. Relationships were re-evaluated. Memories were reassessed. Small moments from the past gained new meanings, now filtered through the awareness of what had been discovered. The Moore House, in turn, ceased to be merely a symbol of mystery and began to carry a definite historical weight. It was no longer a place of unanswered questions, but the setting for a truth difficult to accept. Even so, its presence continued to provoke discomfort, not only because of what happened, but because of what it represented: the possibility that the inexplicable, when finally understood, does not always offer comfort. After reaching its decisive point, the investigation entered a more formal phase. The fragments of identification, the inconsistencies, and the details provided by the suspect began to be organized as the basis for a structured accusation. It wasn't a direct confession, but it was sufficient to support an institutional closure of the case. Still, there were limits. Not all questions were answered. Not all details could be reconstructed with absolute precision. And perhaps more importantly, the full motive, the exact origin of what led to the crime, remained partially obscure. This lack of a full explanation resulted in a kind of incomplete closure. For some, identifying the person responsible was enough. For others, the absence of a clear reason kept the case open at a deeper level. But despite all that, something essential had changed. The cycle of speculation has been interrupted. The city no longer needed to fill the void with assumptions. There was a central narrative supported by evidence that offered a way of understanding, albeit an imperfect one. Over time, Villisca began to rebuild her routine. Not as before, but with a new awareness. Activities returned, interactions were re-established, but there was a permanent layer of caution. A collective memory that would not disappear. The investigator, in turn, concluded his involvement with an ambiguous feeling. He had achieved his goal, connecting the elements, revealing the structure, breaking the silence. But he also understood that the truth, in this case, was not something that presented itself in its entirety. It was fragmented, partial. Sufficient to conclude the process, but not to exhaust its meaning, and perhaps that was the most lasting lesson. Not every mystery, once solved, becomes less disturbing. Sometimes it just changes shape. The house remained, the city continued. And the story, now known, continued to echo, no longer as a question, but as a memory. A reminder that the unknown is not always far away. Sometimes he observes in silence, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. Years have passed, but the house in Villisca has never been just wood and walls again. Visitors still arrive, drawn not only by the history, but by the persistent feeling that something remains there, invisible but present. Some report absolute silence. Others, the opposite, faint, almost imperceptible sounds, like echoes of a time that refuses to disappear. The city moved on, as all cities do, but some stories don't end, they just settle down. And on certain nights, when the wind blows through the empty streets, it still seems like someone is watching, not from the outside, but from within. This story doesn't end here. It continues in every interpretation, in every detail you noticed and perhaps others ignored. What caught your attention the most? Was it the silence of the house, the hidden patterns, or the suspect's behavior? Now I want to know from you, do you believe that everything has truly been explained, or is there still something hidden in this story? Leave your opinion in the comments, share this story with anyone who enjoys true mysteries, and don't forget to follow for more intense tales like this one. After all, some stories don't want to be forgotten, and perhaps this is one of them.